A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Well, the day many analysts have been dreading for years has finally arrived. The transition of power in Tehran is no longer a matter of speculation or intelligence briefings. It is a reality. Mojtaba Khamenei has officially been named the supreme leader of Iran, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has wasted no time in pledging their absolute, undivided loyalty to him.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, Corn, the speed of this consolidation is what really stands out. We have been tracking the health of the late Ayatollah for quite some time, but the way the security apparatus moved to install Mojtaba suggests the level of planning that goes far beyond a simple dynastic succession. Our housemate Daniel sent us this prompt today because the headlines are already calling Mojtaba more hardline than his father. And when your father spent decades calling for the total destruction of Israel and funding global terror, that is a very high bar to clear.
It is an incredibly high bar. I mean, we are talking about a regime that was already the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. So, when people hear that the new guy is even more extreme, it naturally raises the question of what that actually looks like in practice. Are we talking about rhetoric, or are we talking about a fundamental shift in how the Iranian state operates? Today, we are going to look past the Shadow Prince moniker and really dig into the mechanics of this new military autocracy.
And that is the key word right there, Corn, autocracy, but specifically a military-led one. For decades, the Islamic Republic maintained this thin veneer of clerical legitimacy. There was the Assembly of Experts, the clerical councils, the idea that the supreme leader was a man of God first and a statesman second. With Mojtaba, that mask is essentially off. This is a security state transition. We are moving away from the clerical facade toward a pure military junta.
It really feels like the end of the revolutionary era and the beginning of the junta era. I want to start by framing who Mojtaba actually is. For the longest time, he was this figure in the background. He did not hold a public office, he did not give many speeches, yet everyone knew he was the one pulling the strings within the office of the supreme leader, the Beiti Rabari.
He has been the architect of the security apparatus for at least 2 decades. If you look back at the 2009 Green Movement protests, that was really Mojtaba's coming out party, even if it was behind the scenes. He was the one who allegedly coordinated the Basij militia and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to crush those protests with brutal efficiency. He realized then that the survival of the Khamenei line depended entirely on the bayonets of the Guard, not the prayers of the people.
So, when we talk about him being more hardline, it sounds like we are not necessarily talking about him being a more devout radical Islamist than his father, but rather a more efficient and ruthless security operative. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that is the most accurate way to look at it. His father, Ali Khamenei, was a true believer in the revolutionary ideology of 1979. He viewed the world through a lens of resistance against the great Satan and the Zionist entity as a religious obligation. Mojtaba, while certainly sharing those animosities, seems to approach them with the cold logic of an intelligence officer. He is not just interested in the ideology, he is interested in the technical mechanism of control.
That brings up an interesting point about the Gadir intelligence unit. We've talked about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence branch before, but Mojtaba's relationship with them is unique. He essentially built a parallel intelligence structure that reported directly to him, bypassing even the traditional Ministry of Intelligence.
That is a crucial detail, Corn. The Ministry of Intelligence is a state institution, theoretically answerable to the President and the Parliament. But the Gadir unit and the intelligence organization of the Guard are ideological and personal tools. By controlling these, Mojtaba was able to purge any moderate or pragmatic voices within the regime long before his father passed away. Remember when we discussed the internal power struggles in episode 894? We were looking at the vacuum that would be left behind. Well, Mojtaba did not just wait for the vacuum to happen, he spent 10 years filling it with his own loyalists.
It is a classic authoritarian move. You hollow out the existing institutions and replace them with a shadow structure that only answers to you. But I want to push on this idea of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' leverage. Why would they pledge full loyalty to him instead of just taking over themselves? Why do they need a Khamenei on the throne?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and I mean that literally. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not just a military, it is a massive corporate conglomerate. They control somewhere between 30 and 40% of Iran's gross domestic product. They run the construction companies, the telecommunications, the oil engineering, and even the airports. For them, having a Khamenei as the figurehead provides a degree of continuity and religious cover that a pure military general simply could not provide.
So Mojtaba is the CEO, who keeps the shareholders, the guard generals, happy by ensuring their economic interests are protected.
Precisely. It is a corporate military model. In the past, the supreme leader had to balance the interests of the traditional clergy and calm with the interests of the military. Mojtaba has essentially told the clergy to stay in their mosques. His legitimacy does not come from his religious credentials, which, let's be honest, are fairly thin compared to the grand ayatollahs, but from his ability to manage the security industrial complex.
Let's dive deeper into that corporate military model, because I think that's where the real power lies. If the Guard controls 40% of the economy, how does that actually function day to day under Mojtaba?
It functions through what we call the boneyards and massive holding companies like Khatam al-Anbiya. Since the fiscal reforms of 2024, which we've analyzed previously, the Guard has moved to consolidate even more civilian assets under the guise of national security. Mojtaba has been the one signing off on these transfers. He's essentially created a closed-loop economy. The Guard produces the oil, the Guard sells the oil through shadow tankers, the Guard receives the hard currency, and the Guard decides how much of that goes to the people versus how much goes to the missile program.
And because he's the one who facilitated this, the generals owe him everything. It's not about divine right anymore, it's about dividend rights.
And that leads to the systematic dismantling of the Assembly of Experts. This is the body that is legally mandated to choose the supreme leader. In the lead up to this transition, Mojtaba used the intelligence organization of the Guard to vet every single candidate. If you weren't a Mojtaba First loyalist, you were disqualified for lack of revolutionary credentials. By the time Ali Khamenei passed, the assembly wasn't a deliberative body, it was a coronation committee.
It's a brilliant, if terrifying, use of the bureaucracy against itself. But let's move from the internal politics of the regime to the external consequences. If Mojtaba is this technician of terror, what does that mean for the axis of resistance? We've talked about Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the militias in Iraq for years. Does their relationship with Tehran change now?
It changes fundamentally. Under Ali Khamenei, the relationship was often paternal and ideological. He was the marja, the source of emulation. The leaders of these groups looked to him for spiritual guidance. Mojtaba doesn't have that spiritual weight. So, the relationship becomes transactional. It becomes a military command and control structure.
Transactional in what sense? Like, here are 10,000 drones, now go hit these specific coordinates.
Precisely. We are already seeing a shift in proxy funding models post March 2026. Instead of broad financial support for social services and political wings, the money is being funneled almost exclusively into kinetic capabilities. We're talking about precision-guided munitions kits, advanced loitering munitions, and electronic warfare suites. Mojtaba wants a return on investment. If he's sending advanced tech to Lebanon or Yemen, he expects a strategic outcome that directly benefits the Tehran security state's survival.
This connects back to what we discussed in episode 925 regarding the regional security architecture. If the leadership in Tehran is now purely military intelligence focused, the survival calculus changes. His father might have used terror as a tool of ideology, but Mojtaba will use it as a tool of statecraft and budget justification.
You hit the nail on the head. To justify the massive amounts of money flowing into the Guard's coffers, you need an external enemy that is constantly threatening the state. This is why I think we are going to see a shift from the ideological posturing of his father to more frequent and more aggressive kinetic operations. We are talking about more direct missile strikes, more sophisticated cyber warfare, and a more integrated command of the proxy network.
We actually touched on the ideology of this in episode 962, when we looked at why the regime is so obsessed with Israel, despite having no territorial dispute. With Mojtaba, that obsession becomes even more weaponized. It is not just about liberating Jerusalem in some vague future, it is about keeping the regional pot boiling to maintain internal control.
And let's look at the Ring of Fire strategy. Under Mojtaba, the goal isn't just to surround Israel with enemies, it's to create a technologically integrated front. He wants to be able to coordinate a multi-front swarm attack that can overwhelm the Iron Dome and David's Sling. He's looking at the lessons from the Ukraine conflict and the Red Sea skirmishes and applying them with the cold efficiency of a systems engineer.
It makes the whole shadow state we discussed in episode 757 look even more like a formal military command structure. If I am a commander in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, I am probably thrilled about Mojtaba. I no longer have to worry about a moderate president trying to negotiate a nuclear deal that might cut my funding. I have a boss who is one of us.
That is exactly the sentiment on the ground in Tehran right now. The hardline paradox that Daniel mentioned in the prompt is that being more hardline actually means being more predictable in some ways, but more dangerous in others. You are predictable because you know they will always choose the path of escalation and military strength. You are more dangerous because the internal checks and balances, whatever few existed, are now completely gone.
I want to go back to the technical mechanism of how he consolidated power. You mentioned he purged the moderate factions. How did he do that specifically? I mean, Iran has this complex system of the Assembly of Experts and the Guardian Council. How did he bypass those?
He did not bypass them, he captured them. Over the last 5 to 6 years, Mojtaba worked with the intelligence services to disqualify any candidate for the Assembly of Experts who was not a hardline loyalist. They used the vetting process of the Guardian Council as a political scalpel. By the time the succession happened, the Assembly of Experts, the body that is technically supposed to choose the leader, was already filled with men who owed their positions to Mojtaba's influence. It was a slow-motion coup that took a decade to complete.
It is fascinating and horrifying at the same time. He essentially turned a deliberative religious body into a rubber stamp committee. And what about the economy? You mentioned the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controls 30 to 40% of the gross domestic product. How does Mojtaba manage that without causing a total collapse, given the sanctions and the internal unrest?
Well, that is the thing. He does not care about the civilian economy in the way a normal leader would. His focus is on the resistance economy. This involves creating a parallel financial system that uses front companies in places like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Southeast Asia to move oil and bring in dual-use technology. Since the fiscal reforms of 2024, the Guard has become even more adept at bypassing traditional banking sectors. Mojtaba's role is to ensure that the wealth generated by these shadow networks stays within the hands of the loyalist elite.
So, if you're a regular person in Tehran, your life probably gets worse under Mojtaba because the state is no longer even pretending to prioritize your welfare. But if you are a mid-level officer in the Guard, your life might actually get better.
Precisely. It is a feudal system with high-tech surveillance, and that leads to another hardline aspect, the use of technology for internal suppression. Mojtaba has been a huge proponent of the National Information Network, basically Iran's version of the Great Firewall of China. He wants to be able to shut down the internet with the flip of a switch while keeping the Guard's internal communications running. This is a man who understands that in 2026, power is not just about who has the most tanks, but who controls the data.
It really feels like we are moving into a period of high-tech dark ages for the Iranian people. But let's look at the international implications, especially for the United States and Israel. If we are dealing with a purely military intelligence regime now, does that mean diplomacy is officially dead?
I would say any diplomacy that involves trust or shared values is definitely dead. Any future negotiations with Mojtaba's Iran will be purely transactional. They might agree to a temporary de-escalation if it gives them breathing room to fix a domestic issue, or if they are facing a credible military threat that could unseat the regime. But the idea of a grand bargain, or a return to the nuclear deal of 2015, is a fantasy. Mojtaba views those as weaknesses that his father was wrong to entertain even briefly.
That is a stark assessment. It suggests that the regional security architecture we saw shift in episode 925 is only going to become more polarized. On one side, you have the Abraham Accords nations and Israel, backed by the United States. On the other, you have this security state, Iran, which is now more closely aligned with other authoritarian regimes that value stability through force above all else.
And you can bet that Mojtaba is looking at the success of other security-first regimes and thinking that is the blueprint. He is not interested in being a global pariah for the sake of it. He wants to be a regional hegemon that cannot be ignored. And he thinks the best way to do that is to make the cost of opposing Iran so high that the West eventually just gives up and leaves the region.
Which, of course, is exactly why we cannot do that. The stakes for Israel are existential. If you have a leader in Tehran who is more efficient at exporting terror and more focused on kinetic operations, the margin for error for the Israel Defense Forces becomes razor thin.
We have already seen a shift in how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps funds its proxies. It used to be about small arms and basic rockets. Now, it is about precision-guided munitions kits, advanced loitering munitions, and electronic warfare suites. Under Mojtaba, I expect to see even more technology transferred to Hezbollah and the Houthis. He wants to create a ring of fire that is so technically advanced that it can overwhelm even the best missile defense systems.
So, when people say he is more hardline, they are really saying he is more capable. His father was a poet and a theologian who hated the West. Mojtaba is a technician who has spent his life learning how to fight the West.
That is a great way to put it, Korn. He is a technician of terror. And that leads us to the internal risks for him. A military-led regime is inherently more prone to internal fractures than a religiously led one. If the divine mandate is gone, and it is all about the money and the power, what happens when the money runs low? Or what happens when two different factions within the Guard disagree on strategy?
Right, because in a clerical system, the supreme leader is the final arbiter of God's will. You cannot really argue with that without being a heretic. But in a military junta, if the leader makes a strategic blunder, his subordinates might decide they can do a better job.
We discussed this succession risk in episode 894. While Mojtaba has successfully taken the throne, the long-term stability of a regime that relies purely on coercion is very low. He has to keep the guard generals fed, and he has to keep the intelligence services loyal. If he fails to deliver on the economic front, or if a military adventure goes horribly wrong, like a direct confrontation with the United States or Israel that destroys major guard assets, he could face a palace coup.
So, the Shadow Prince is now in the spotlight. He has the crown, but he also has the target on his back. I think we need to talk about what listeners should be watching for in the coming months. What are the canaries in the coal mine for a Mujtaba-led Iran?
First, watch the assembly of experts. If we see a continued purge of even the slightly conservative clerics in favor of younger, military-affiliated figures, that is a sign that the clerical facade is being dismantled even faster than we expected. Second, monitor the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic divestment from civilian sectors. If they start pulling out of things like telecommunications and moving all that capital into defense industrial sectors, it means they are bracing for a long-term conflict.
And third, I would say watch the Persian Gulf and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. If we see an uptick in unprofessional naval encounters or more aggressive harassment of shipping, that is Mujtaba flexing his muscles to show both his internal and external critics that the new boss is tougher than the old boss.
And don't forget the cyber front. Iran has been investing heavily in offensive cyber capabilities. I would expect to see more sophisticated attacks on critical infrastructure in the West and in Israel. For Mojtaba, cyber is the perfect gray zone weapon. It allows him to inflict damage and project power without necessarily triggering a full-scale kinetic war that could threaten his regime's survival.
It really feels like the era of the Shadow Prince has ended, and the era of the security autocrat has begun. It is a sobering thought, especially living here in Jerusalem. The rhetoric from Tehran has always been hot, but the cold, calculating nature of this new leadership is in some ways more concerning.
It is, but it also provides a degree of clarity. For years, there was this hope in some Western capitals that Iran could be reformed or that moderates could be empowered. Mojtaba's ascension should put the final nail in the coffin of that delusion. We're dealing with a military junta that happens to wear turbans when the cameras are on. Once you accept that, your strategy for dealing with them has to change. It is no longer about engagement. It is about containment, deterrence, and, ultimately, supporting the Iranian people who want to reclaim their country from this military corporate octopus.
That brings up the question of legitimacy. Can a regime survive without the divine mandate of the clergy? For 47 years, the Islamic Republic relied on the idea that the supreme leader was the representative of the hidden imam on earth. If Mojtaba is just a security operative in a robe, does the average religious Iranian still buy into the system?
That is the existential threat to the regime. By choosing Mojtaba, the IRGC has prioritized short-term stability over long-term legitimacy. They have traded the mandate of heaven for the mandate of the machine gun. In the short term, the machine gun is very effective. But history shows us that when a regime loses its ideological soul and becomes a mere mechanism for wealth extraction and power preservation, it becomes brittle.
So, while Mojtaba looks stronger than his father because he has the direct loyalty of the military, he might actually be more vulnerable to a sudden collapse if the people, or the lower ranks of the military, decide the emperor has no clothes, or in this case, the leader has no holiness.
It is a high-stakes gamble. Mojtaba is betting that high-tech surveillance and economic control can replace religious fervor. He is betting that he can be a Persian Putin or a Tehran-based Xi Jinping. But Iran is not Russia or China. It has a long history of popular uprisings and a very young, very tech-savvy population that is increasingly disconnected from the values of 1979.
This has been a deep dive, to say the least. I feel like I have a much better handle on why the Shadow Prince is such a pivotal figure for the next decade of Middle Eastern politics. Herman, thanks for bringing all that research to the table. I know you've been digging through those Iranian security papers for weeks.
It is a fascinating, if somewhat grim, subject. But as we always say on My Weird Prompts, understanding the why behind these shifts is the only way to navigate the what happens next.
And a big thank you to Daniel for sending this in. It was a timely and necessary look at a major geopolitical shift. If you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and often dark corners of global power, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation.
Yeah, we love seeing the community grow. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including those ones we mentioned today about the architecture of hatred and the Iranian power vacuum at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, and you can even get in touch with us through the contact form if you have a topic you want us to tackle.
We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there to get the latest episodes as soon as they drop. We have been at this for over 1,000 episodes now, and the prompts just keep getting more interesting.
They really do. It is a wild world out there, and we're just glad to have you all along for the ride.
Well, that is it for today's episode of My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you next time. Stay curious and stay informed.
And stay vigilant. Until next time.
Take care.
Bye now.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.